Is that use of that?
Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this event.
Sitting right by the rocking chair.
Actually, 24 years ago, when Bill Gardner was Secretary of State, he thought it'd be a great idea to have a panel of former governors talk about their experiences with the New Hampshire presidential primary, first in the nation primary. And it's amazing how time flies, but it was a great event then, and hopefully all of you have the opportunity to see the video that's out there about that event. Some really interesting stories and information that came out of that. So I have the privilege of introducing the panelists for today's event. And this is going to be a similar discussion to the one that took place 24 years ago, and hopefully we can kind of fill in the gaps of interesting events that have taken place over the last 24 years. So to my immediate right, first of all, these guys really don't need any introduction, but former Governor John Sununu was the 75th governor of the state of New Hampshire. He served from 1983 to 1989, served his governorship while Ronald Reagan was president. And then after he completed his term as governor, he went on to serve as the White House Chief of Staff under George H.W. Bush. Next in line is Governor John Lynch. John was the 80th governor of the state of New Hampshire. He served from 2005 to 2013, and as Governor Sununu said, he set the record with serving 4 terms, and as of the present time, he's the longest serving governor of the state of New Hampshire. He's going to be joined shortly by Governor Sununu, our current governor, when he completes his term. John served his governorship while George W. Bush and Barack Obama were president. Over here on the end is Bill Gardner, former Secretary of State. Bill was the longest serving Secretary of State ever from the state of New Hampshire, and the second longest nationally. He can tell you some great stories about Abraham Lincoln, although Abraham Lincoln did predate his term by quite a bit. Bill started as Secretary of State in 1976 after serving a couple of terms in the House of Representatives. He is a prime reason why New Hampshire has held the first in the nation presidential primary to the present day, a string now of 104 years. While he was Secretary of State, he met hundreds of candidates for President of the United States. Just goes to show you how many individuals have wanted to run for that job, and they found New Hampshire to be a great place where that opportunity could take place. So I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Bill to get the program started, I think, with a video.
Thanks, Dave. First thing we're going to have is a film for about 3.5 minutes. And the film, the first part of it, there's no voice, but it goes back to the first in the nation in 1920. And there was a candidate who won that first primary was Leonard Wood. None of you probably have any idea who he was, but he was pretty famous, one of the most famous people in the country during his time, and he won most of the primaries across the country in 1920, but he was defeated at the convention by Warren Harding, who went on to be president. And so you'll see him, and when he was famous because he was actually Teddy Roosevelt's commanding officer at San Juan Hill. Teddy Roosevelt gets all the recognition, but he was the top person. And he went on to be governor of Cuba and then governor of the Philippines. And he was called back because the army was trying to get Geronimo and they went for years and years and years, not able to get him. And they were finally decided that if anyone could get him, it would be Leonard Wood. And so they brought him back, and he captured Geronimo, and he was really famous for that back in that era. And when he ran, he was actually a native son. At least he was given that recognition because his mother was married to a doctor who was doing some research at Gardner. And she was expecting. And so she was on a train on her way back home, and she started in labor, and they had to stop at the next station, and the next station was Winchester, New Hampshire. And so she got off. She had her child. It took 3 months before they were strong enough to continue, and that was it. But when he ran, he became a native son, and we haven't had very many, but.
Primary elections in New Hampshire for delegates to the Democratic and Republican national conventions find candidates and campaign managers pulling no punches. Everyone is in there pitching in an endeavor to gauge the mood of the American people. This is the first real popularity test for the favorites, and Senator Robert A. Taft comes to New Hampshire to make his bid.
And therefore, what we start here in New Hampshire today, I believe must succeed next summer and next November. And therefore, I want to express my appreciation to you and ask you for your support in the primary this March. Thank you very much.
So it's the two governors that we have with us, both have been involved in New Hampshire since the 1970s, and so they've seen it all of these years, and I was a freshman legislator with John Sununu, and he was elected in 1972, and John Lynch was living in Manchester, and he was the executive director of the Democratic Party. When Jimmy Carter was running in '76, he was in there before that. And they have a wealth of experience and their recollections of the main type of events that happened during each of the presidential primary cycles. On the seats that you have, there's a little piece of paper that in 1968 something happened here that got the attention of the whole country, and that was the first page of the Time magazine that came out right after the '68 primary. And if you just read the first two paragraphs, you'll see that the state had a reputation of doing things that were not expected. Had a reputation of having a lot of unscripted moments, and the results didn't turn out to be the way a lot of people thought they would be. And that was the reputation in 1968, and it has continued ever since. So David mentioned 24 years ago that there was an event like this, and it was the exact same time. It was 2 days after the Iowa caucus back then. And we started with what happens after the Iowa caucus? Does New Hampshire, something happen here that is affected by, because of what happened in Iowa? And so the first things I'd like to begin with is, here we are today. The day before yesterday was the Iowa caucus. This time around, was there anything about Iowa that you think had some impact, if any? Either one of you.
You might as well use your line or others. Go ahead, feel free to use my line. I'm not going to plagiarize your line. Well, I've often said, been quoted as saying, that Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks presidents. And to some extent that is true, especially in a number of significant elections. Now, you asked what happened this time. We'll know in 5 days, but until 5 days have elapsed, or 6 days, until we count our ballots on the 23rd, we're not going to find out whether we are correcting Iowa's mistake or just going along and replicating it. It is not. It's important to understand, with all the hype the press is giving to the Trump victory in Iowa, it really was not the most, it doesn't present the most difficult situation for someone who's trying to catch someone coming out of Iowa. In 1988, when I was governor, George Bush, Pat Robertson, and Bob Dole go into Iowa. Dole comes out with, I think, 35% of the vote. Pat Robertson has 27% of the vote, so between them, they have 62% of the vote. George Bush lags behind with 19% of the vote out of Iowa, comes into New Hampshire, wins New Hampshire by 10 points, and goes on to get the nomination. So Trump getting half of the vote, either DeSantis or Haley, are not that far behind in terms of historical terms. So the next 5-6 days, it's up to New Hampshire to decide what it wants to do. And maybe it will do something dramatic, or maybe it will just go along with what happened in Iowa. The nice thing about living in this state is you really can't predict it until it's over.
And I certainly agree with that. I think the dynamics are very different, New Hampshire versus Iowa. The Iowa turnout in the Republican primary was 14%. New Hampshire's turnout is a lot higher than that. And our biggest block of voters are undecideds or independents. Iowa doesn't do this. And independents can show up and they can vote in either the Democratic primary or the Republican primary on the day of the primary vote. So our dynamics are very different. So it's hard to know whether Iowa is reflective and going to be predictive of what happens in New Hampshire. It's impossible to know. I will say that my first election was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter won, the story was that he won Iowa. And he did win Iowa. Undecideds won Iowa by 10 points more than Jimmy Carter. And people thought that he had momentum coming into New Hampshire. But Iowa had no indication and no impact on what happened in New Hampshire with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter did win New Hampshire. But what happened was Mo Udall, and Kathy, I'm sure you remember this, Mo Udall, everybody expected Mo Udall to win New Hampshire. And a lot of the activists were supporting Mo Udall. And then what happened? Birch Bayh entered the contest. And Birch Bayh took votes away from Mo Udall. And then Terry Sanford and Fred Harris and Sergeant Shriver, they all took votes away from Mo Udall. So along comes Jimmy Carter, positions himself as a more conservative, more moderate candidate, and wins New Hampshire with 28% of the vote. So there's a lot of dynamics that go on in these elections. So again, it's hard to know, and as Governor Sununu said, we'll know next Tuesday exactly what happens, but it's hard to predict at this point.
So, I just want to mention that these two governors, both of them have accomplished something that no one else in New Hampshire has accomplished. So, John Sununu, we have until we only have 2 statewide officers that are elected by the people, the governor and the U.S. Senate. And the U.S. Senate only began in 1912. Before that, it was elected by the legislature. Well, Governor Sununu, you have a father and 2 sons. 3 of them have been elected by the people to statewide office. No other family can say that. And for John Lynch, he served more years than any other person. When the state went to a 2-year term in 1878, no person has served as long as governor than John Lynch has served. Now, Governor Sununu, your son will get there at some point, unless he...
Governor Sununu promised me that he'd ask Chris to resign the day before. I will continue the status as the longest-serving governor. Thank you very much, Governor Sununu.
Let me tell you a sort of a family story, but it really reflects what I think is so great about New Hampshire, that even though it has traditions, it's willing to break traditions in an appropriate way. When I first ran for governor, you go down to Washington and you start talking to consultants, right, when you're thinking of running. And every consultant I talked to in Washington said, there is no way you can win in Yankee, New Hampshire with a name like Sununu. I ended up, by the way, being the first governor whose last name ends in a vowel, except for a couple of silent E's before me. So they tell me you can't win in New Hampshire with a name like Sununu. 20 years later, when my son John wins, everybody was saying, well, the only reason he won in New Hampshire is his name is Sununu. It's a state that adapts. It's a state that stops to listen. It's a state in which they really do spend time in deciding which candidate they want to be for. In a lot of places, the vote is who do you want to be against. I think in New Hampshire, people really work hard on who they want to be for. And I think our structure of government here is what makes it that way. Our local elections are so important in terms of your pocketbook. The school board, the planning board, the board of selectmen, the budget committee. The bulk of the spending in this state is still determined by local actions. It may go through a process through the state legislature, but the determinant of total state spending is driven by local actions and local boards. And so everybody understands that, and I think that's a stimulus to participate in the process.
Well, I have a first-hand account of explaining that. I remember driving when you were first running, and on the side of the road, the first sign I saw first that had Sununu on it, it said in big print, "What is a Sununu?" And it had A, B, and C. And number one was a Caribbean cocktail. And another one was a type of ice cream.
And
the third one I don't remember.
A Japanese car.
So it was really, we've never had anything like that since. But I've always felt it's so much more difficult for the first person to do it. But once the first person does it, and how that person is looked at after having done it, makes all the difference in the world later. It's so much easier because it's such an unusual name, but if you have in your mind thoughts about it and they're favorable, it's really advantageous. And in his case, his two sons that both have held the statewide office.
Can I tell a Jimmy Carter story? I had just moved into the state in 1969. My first primary was 72, but that was a foregone primary on both sides, so to speak. Along comes 76, and I'm chairman of the planning board in Salem. And I got to know the local reporter, a lady by the name of Rita Weefers, who was a die-hard Democrat. And as chairman of the planning board, I got invited to a breakfast in which a lady by the name of Rosalind Carter was going to speak and tell us why her husband was running for president. I went to that breakfast, and I came out of there completely awed by how much this wife of a potential candidate knew, not only about the state of New Hampshire, but about the town of Salem. There were half a dozen of us that were town officials that went up and chatted with her later, and she knew what everyone did in terms of town offices. She knew what their private job was. And all that indicated to me was here was a campaign that was doing all the detailed work to lay the foundation for a New Hampshire-style campaign. I went back, I called Rita Weefers, and I said, I just talked to the wife of your nominee. She said, who is that? I said, Rosalind Carter. She said, never heard of her. I said, pay attention. Her husband's going to be the Democrat nominee. And it obviously turned out.
Rosalind came to see me also, and she knew all about me, my background, where I lived. And then after she left, she sent me, we're talking about George Bush, sent me this lovely handwritten note that I don't have. I wish I had saved it. Maybe you took it, Kathy. But it just, we talk about how you save stuff rather than just make a phone call. It's a lovely note. And if she did it for me, she probably did it for lots of other people across New Hampshire.
I don't recall, but I may have gotten. I mean, they were that detail oriented, and it really struck me how prepared they were and how much they knew about New Hampshire, and frankly, in my opinion, how much they were betting it all on the New Hampshire primary.
No, I mean, as I said, I think the dynamics favored Jimmy Carter because everybody else was running to the left of him, and they cannibalized each other's votes. So I think that's how we won. But getting back to the unpredictability of seeing what happened in Iowa, and then what happens in New Hampshire. When Hillary Clinton ran against Barack Obama in Iowa, she finished third. So I'm governor at the time. All the pre-polling showed that Barack Obama was going to beat Hillary Clinton by 10 to 15 points. So on election day, I go around to all the media outlets, which is traditional, what you do, and the media was asking me, do you think Barack Obama can beat her by 20 points? Because all the polls showed double digits, and he had momentum. And she ended up winning. By a little bit, but she ended up winning that primary. So it's really hard to predict what's going to happen.
Let me comment on the independent vote, because it's really completely misunderstood by the press. Independent registration, not what do we call it?
Undecided.
Undecided. It's not really undecided. It's mostly people who know they are really Democrats or know they are really Republicans, but choose to designate themselves that way because the opportunity to have that designation is there, and it provides a lot of advantages. You can vote in either primary you want. It keeps certain people from knocking on your door. It drives the pollsters crazy. So there's a lot of perverse reasons. But undecided is not as fluid. Undecided in New Hampshire is not as fluid as the press makes it out to be. And there are people there that know they're going to vote in the Republican primary every 4 years, or know they're going to vote in the Democrat primary every 4 years. So it drives the pollsters crazy. It drives people trying to predict turnout crazy. And even after the fact, it drives people crazy trying to analyze what happened. But it is so different than what the press and most outside analysts think is going on in the state.
That's one of the things that people have this misconception about New Hampshire, that there are these independents. We call them undeclared. They haven't declared officially. But no one votes in the New Hampshire primary without being a registered member of the party at the time they vote. And those that come in on primary day and register or come in as an undeclared, they have to declare. And our law says that when you declare, you are saying that you intend to affiliate with the candidates of the party you are taking a ballot on. So no one actually is independent when they're voting. They have declared. They have declared the party. What we don't have is we don't have a durational requirement. So once you're in, you can't, and it used to be you can't get out. It used to be 30 years ago when you declared, you could never be undeclared again once you're declared once. You could change from one party to another, but you couldn't undeclare. And the legislature made that change. And so a person did not have to stay in the party for 10 years or 5 years or even a year. And then they made it easier by saying that when you leave, rather than making you come back to get back to being an undeclared, you can just sign the form, and when they meet next, our supervisors, they'll take care of it. But everyone who votes in a primary has, I mean, they're not actually asked to take that pledge, but that's what the law says. When you declare a party and you take a party ballot, you are intending to support the people, the rest of the people on that party. So it's a fine line, kind of, but it's not like people can just come in and just remain as independent. And it's interesting this time because what isn't talked about is that in South Carolina, that on the Democratic side believe that their primary is the first. In South Carolina, there's no party registration. So anyone in South Carolina can vote in whatever party they want. They can't vote in both, but they can only vote in one. So what happened in 2020 in South Carolina, the Republicans decided that there was no need to have a primary. The incumbent was the president, Donald Trump, and so he was just going to get all the delegates. So the people in South Carolina only had one opportunity if they wanted to participate in a primary. And the question is, how many of those people were really affiliated Republicans but voted in the Democratic primary? And would they have voted for Sanders or would they have voted for Biden? And what's odd about it is that the Democratic Party, if you remember this, but George Wallace won the Democratic presidential primary in Michigan. George Wallace was a right-to-work state governor. Michigan then was the most unionized state in the whole country. And no one could figure out how could a governor, Alabama, right to work, win the primary. And what they found out afterwards, that over a third of the voters in the Democratic primary in Michigan actually were Republicans. And so the Democratic Party went to the Supreme Court to say, we're not going to allow this anymore. We're not going to allow people of the other party to be able to, and the reason why that happened was because the papers that are on your chair, everyone thought that Nixon was going to have a battle with Romney and Rockefeller and that LBJ was automatic. But it ended up that after New Hampshire, Nixon was the nominee basically, and the Democrats had this big contest. So in Michigan, people that were Republican had the option of voting in the other party. And so sometimes things like that happen, and there's nothing been written about South Carolina for years ago, whether that could have, and it's odd for the Democrats now are moving South Carolina up, but they were not happy years ago that people of the other party were actually deciding who was going to win.
They moved their primary up, and then the Democrat Party in South Carolina, by decree, declared the winner of their primary was the incumbent president, Joe Biden. So the new the first in the nation primary for Democrats is not a primary. They're not going to vote. I can't explain it.
Well, you know, I've said we've had our primary, both Republican and Democrat, presidential primary for 100 years, and it's going to continue for about 100 years. I think what the Democratic National Committee does, or the Republican National Committee, or the White House, or future White Houses, it's not going to affect our having first in the nation primary. It may affect whether some people come or not, but we're still going to have our first in the nation primary. As you said last time, you all met, you know, people in New Hampshire take this primary very, very seriously. They take the time, they work at it, they take the time to meet all the candidates, sometimes multiple occasions. They want to know their position on issues. They learn that. And they also want to look at the candidates in the eyes and get a sense of their temperament, get a sense of their integrity, their personality. So I think New Hampshire does not only the country a service, but also candidates a service. I've had a number of candidates say to me that because they've entered the New Hampshire primary, they become better candidates. The New Hampshire primary makes them better candidates. And also, people who are fortunate enough to go to the White House and become president, they say the New Hampshire primary makes them better presidents. So I think it would be a real mistake and a shame to relinquish our role as the first in the nation presidential primary.
Based on your experience, is there a common denominator in a successful presidential candidate going in the New Hampshire primary?
I think the most important single ingredient is to be genuine. I think New Hampshire voters can crack through the facade of phoniness that a lot of people bring in here. And some of them start that way, and by the time they've gone through some of their town halls, they discover they got to change their ways. But I think that's the single, because within a primary, there's not really that much difference on issues. That's what everyone forgets. In the Republican primary, most Republicans are Republican. In the Democrat primary, most Democrats are Democrat. And so there's a huge overlap on issues. But in terms of being genuine, being capable, it's all the personality issues, I think, that is the common denominator that makes the difference.
I agree, and the ability to connect with people, which is sort of what you're saying. Instead of looking around to see who the next person is you want to talk to, you look at them as if they're the only person there. That's important, that connection that candidates are able to make.
Look, Bill Clinton had it. Even though the press didn't think he had it, George H.W. Bush really did have it. He was clumsy enough that he was every man. And people understood that. I actually think that in a way, Gary Hart had it when he won the primary, and then shot himself in the foot 15 different ways. But candidates that have done well in New Hampshire have that capacity of empathy with the voters.
One of the things about our primary, a lot of people know that people's minds are made up at the end. Most people want to watch the whole thing because they know from years before things happen that have a significant impact. Because the primary, you're deciding among people that are much closer ideologically than you are in an election. Governor Lynch mentioned about Hillary Clinton and Obama, and how everybody thought Obama was going to win, and whether there was a moment there with Hillary that kind of changed a lot. So could you do the Reagan?
We're still trying to negotiate to get everybody on the stage, to open it up to all the candidates. But George Bush marches up in through the door and up to the stage and sits there alone. That's my memory, and then there's sort of a pause, and people are wondering, I think, and no one quite knows what's going to happen next. Is Ronald Reagan going to go up on that stage or not? Are the other candidates going to go up on that stage or not?
To have all 7 of them there at once was, I think, not coincidence.
When did you know or finally accept the fact that all 7 were going to come out on stage?
When they walked past me, onto the stage.
The first I knew that they were going to be on the stage was when I saw them coming out on the stage. Someone did ask me if chairs were going to be provided, and I said no.
They don't. The
fireworks begin.
President Reagan
If we may have the first question.
wanted to make an opening statement. The statement was not provided for in the format.
To make an announcement Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute? Is this on? Mr. Green, would you turn that microphone off? You asked for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
George Bush is a thorough gentleman, and we'd all agree with that. And yet I was Mr. Reagan's chairman, I was Mr. Bush's chairman, he was a gentleman also. But that night, he let his acting abilities overshadow his courtesies. That's exactly what happened. Mr. Breen, whose name was really Breen but not Green, had made a deal with the Telegraph that there'd be a one-on-one debate between Mr. Bush and Mr. Reagan, and that was what it was going to be, just the two of them, nobody else. And without telling the Bush people what Mr. Reagan was doing, he invited the other 6 candidates who were in that race to come to the event, brought them up on the platform, stood behind Mr. Reagan, and Reagan said, "I want these people to speak." And Mr. Bush, who had agreed to the terms of the arrangement, sat there. I mean, he was a guest, so he did not dispute this. But the moderator, Mr. Breen, was so upset by it that he told Mr. Reagan he's going to turn off his microphone. And Mr. Reagan, being an actor and being able to jump in the moment, made history by saying, "I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green," and in fact he had paid for it. The Reagan people wanted the debate, so they paid for it, and that's what happened. But the story has been twisted so much that it made Mr. Bush look like he was the bad bunny, and really he wasn't. He was being a gentleman, he was behaving himself, and Mr. Reagan went beyond what I thought was a proper position for him to take under those circumstances.
The defining moments, they can be public, like we saw with this video, or they can be private in terms of defining moments. So I think we had a defining moment with Gore's campaign in 2000. So he started off as an awful campaign, and it wasn't Al Gore, it was his people. His people were keeping him behind the podium. Sometimes there were no rope lines, and because they didn't want to make a mistake. They were very, very cautious, very conservative. And then after the event, what they did is they would talk among themselves. Did Al Gore enjoy it? He's the vice president. Was he happy with the event? That's what they said over and over again. And finally dawned on me what was happening is they thought the vice president was the customer. And he wasn't the customer. It was the people who were there at the event were the customer. So we had a meeting, I think it was at Manchester Airport, a bunch of us involved with this campaign, and Al Gore, and then with his campaign staff. And we said, you just have to let Al Gore be Al Gore. He's a very, very gregarious guy, likes people, smart with people, good with people, has all the traits that you mentioned, Governor Sununu, that you need to have in New Hampshire. And they let him be himself. And it turned out that it changed the whole dynamics of the campaign. And he won the New Hampshire primary, and then went on to be elected President of the United States. What? He wasn't?
Are you a denier? Are you a We found an election denier.
He actually did win the popular vote. And those damn Chats out of Florida. But what we should say also is that if Al Gore had won New Hampshire, he would have been elected President of the United States. So we can't take, or any candidate can't take our 4 electoral votes for granted. And he didn't win because of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader got 22,000 votes, took those votes away from Al Gore. If Ralph Nader hadn't been in the race, Gore would have become President of the United States. Those hanging chads.
What a defining situation. it's generally felt by people who analyze the '88 primary in New Hampshire, Republican primary, that an important event that occurred was when the Bush campaign decided to run the response ad against Bob Dole, who had been accusing Bush of being a taxer. Bush put, actually, Roger Ailes put the ad together, a response ad pointing out all the times Bob Dole in the Senate had voted for raising taxes. And it took us a long time to convince George Bush to run this negative ad against Bob Dole, but about Thursday evening, he agreed, and so now we have the task on Friday to get this ad to all the TV stations and scheduled to be run on the last weekend before the primary on Tuesday. And in those days, it wasn't as easy as it is now for stations to make changes. And so a lot of the stations did what they call closing their ad book on Fridays for the weekend. And WMUR was in that category. So, what do? You're going to pause the story here, and I have to give you the predicate to the story. And the predicate to the story is that the Vice President Bush was at Kennebunkport for the Christmas holiday. They celebrated Christmas in Kennebunkport. And I called him, I don't remember exactly what day, but it was a day that they had really some family events there, and I said, Mr. Vice President, I hate to bother you, but can you come down and do a half-hour interview for WMUR in their studio? It really is important. And he said, oh, John, I don't want to come down. I said, Mr. Vice President, I wouldn't press you if I didn't think it was important. So he and Mrs. Bush come down, and they're such gracious people. They not only do the half-hour interview, but they go around and talk to everybody at the station. And everybody had brought their kids and their grandkids in to have pictures with the Vice President. And they have pictures with the Vice President. They spend all the time that's necessary there to be courteous. And they go back, and on the way out, the President says, now tell me why we had to do this. And I said, Mr. Vice President, I don't know right now, but someday I'll explain why we did this. I'll be able to explain why we did this. Come back now. We want to put the ads on the weekend on WMUR. I pick up the phone. I call David Zamichow, who's general manager at MUR. I said, David, I know your books are closed for the weekend, but we'd really like to change out the ads on the time we bought. We'd like to put a new ad in. And Zamichow says, I'd be happy to come in and take care of that for my good friend George Bush. When all that happened, I went to the Vice President. I said, I can now answer your question. He said, what do you mean, my question? I said, you asked me why you had to come down to do that interview just before New Year's. It's because we needed that to get your ads on TV. And obviously, the conventional wisdom is that ad made a big difference in the campaign.
I think defining moments affecting the New Hampshire primary, sometimes they happen outside of New Hampshire, but they have a major impact on the New Hampshire primary and the outcome of the New Hampshire primary. And the best example I know of that is Roger Mudd's interview with Ted Kennedy. I don't know if you all remember that, but basically Roger Mudd was meeting with Ted, interviewing Ted Kennedy in November, a couple of months before the New Hampshire primary, and asked Ted Kennedy, why do you want to be president? And Ted Kennedy, it seemed like it was minutes before he answered. And then he kind of stuttered, and then he talked some policy wonk, and he couldn't answer the question. Why do you want to be president? So Roger Mudd is known as the person who took Ted Kennedy down, which he didn't want to be known that way. But that interview played over and over and over again. And then the columnist started talking about the interview. And Walter Mondale started talking about the interview. And they all thought that Ted Kennedy really didn't want to be president. That's why he couldn't answer the question. And I think that also affected the outcome in New Hampshire as a defining moment. I'm sure you remember that.
Oh, yeah. You know, Gene Shaheen gave a good example of a defining moment that really ended up not producing in the end, but was for an instant a real defining moment. And that's when Gary Hart was up here running. They went up to the North Country and they went to a lumberman's event. And Gary Hart grabbed an axe and threw the axe, and it went right in the bullseye. And the press got that video. And that video went like wildfire all across the country to all the news outlets. And for that instant, and through the primary in New Hampshire, Gary Hart was the darling of the Democrat Party, and I think he won the primary with about 42% of the vote. So that one instant, and that was really an instant, is the kind of an event that can have a spectacularly disproportionate effect on what happens in the primary.
And I saw the video of you all, and I heard the story just a little bit differently. The story I heard, no, it's actually better. That Gary Hart threw the axe, hit the bullseye. There was no press around. So the staffers all went and got the press and said, "You got to watch this."
Oh,
and Gary, I think that's true. So
Well,
that Gary
I
Hart,
plagiarized from Jean Shaheen, and she told it the way I
I
told
know.
it.
So Gary Hart took the axe and did it again, a bullseye, and that's the story.
That's the story.
Was covered by the media.
Well, this primary, you think after all the years that we've watched the primary, been a part of the primary, that we've seen everything. But this time, a few things that we never saw. We've never had a primary with a former president coming to the State House to file to run again, a former president, and basically have two presidents that potentially, that are participating in one in each party. And the incumbent president is not participating, but he's participating in the election. And the Republicans have a former president. So we've had nothing like that before. And what that, the impact of that, there's going to be an impact. I'm just not sure if it's going to be a lower turnout or a higher.
But you know, Bill, even with all that, my feeling is even the former presidents and the current president, if they really wanted to win the New Hampshire primary, they got to do it the old-fashioned way, and they got to put time in here. And I think the Trump campaign is beginning to feel that way, and I think you're going to see more events than they had anticipated they were going to have to do. You've got to do and put the work in. And New Hampshire voters expect you to show up when you say you're going to show up. One example of that is in '88, about the third or the fourth day after Iowa, we got a snowstorm here in New Hampshire. And the Bush campaign had committed to do an event in Wolfboro. And all the press was assuming that event was going to be canceled. And when they found out we were putting the vice president in a couple of Suburbans, we actually had Ted Williams with us, so we stuck Ted in there also. And we were going north. I think a lot of the press chose not to cover it because they thought it was going up in a snowstorm up to Wolfboro didn't make sense to them. We not only had slow traveling going up there because of the storm, but we had to stop in Laconia for an ice fishing contest. And Ted Williams, who's an avid fisherman, we ended up staying an extra half hour there compared to what we wanted. And we got to Wolfboro about an hour and a half, an hour and 10 minutes to an hour and a half late. there's 4,000 people crammed into the Wolfboro High School gymnasium. And when Bush walked in, he got, I think, the biggest hand he got of the whole campaign, because everybody was just thrilled that he showed up. And when the press asked me why we did it, I said, I think you're going to find in the numbers that the vice president's going to do even better in the North Country than he does in the rest of the state. Well, Bush ended up winning New Hampshire by 10 points. He ended up winning the North counties of the state by 15 to 20 points. And half of his total margin came up in that lightly populated but very consistently voting area, and I think is one of the best examples I know of how important doing it the New Hampshire way is for all of these campaigns to pay attention to. It's really reflected on the quality of life and where we live, and it's the fact that we are the most self-governing population in the world. I mentioned earlier how important school committees are, how important selectmen are, how important budget committees are, how important planning boards are in determining how much you spend across the board in the state. You add up all these town by town, city by city obligations, which for the most part are voted on at either a town meeting or a school district meeting. We vote our spending. We have 400 in the legislature. We have 250 some odd towns. And in each of those towns, every 2 years, the selectmen are voted on, the budget committee is voted on, the school board is voted on, and so on. When you add it up, I said it in the year 2000, I'll say it again, it is statistically correct that over your lifetime, either you, your spouse, or one of your neighbors on either side has run for office. We run for office, we serve our towns, we govern ourselves, we participate in the process, and as a result, we begin to know the difference between just talk when people campaign and when people get elected, how the obligation to deliver. And you add that up with what I think is the shortest distance between the governor's office and the people of the state, around the state. Look, a lot of people report it and joke about it, but your current governor goes shopping once a week at Market Basket, and everybody knows that if they want to catch him, they can catch him there, and it takes them 3 hours to pick up 8 or 10 items, but people can reach him. When I was in office, my home phone number was in the phone book. I don't know what you did, John, but there are different things different governors do to keep close to the electorate. And I don't think anywhere else in the country or anywhere else in the world is that reality there.
I think probably half the people in New Hampshire still have my cell phone. My personal cell phone. I didn't have a phony one that was a governmental issue. It was my own cell phone. And I did have the experience, just like you said. I mean, people would come up to me and say, Governor, I have a problem with my septic system in my backyard. Can you get somebody to fix it? Sure. You know, I mean, but that's what you're there for, to make a difference in people's lives. And there is no barrier between the governor and the people of New Hampshire. That's what makes it special.
And it is not like that anywhere else. It is not. And people don't understand how special what we have really is. We sometimes take it for granted, and it's one of the reasons I keep harping on it and pounding on it. Because local funding, the fact that we vote local funding, to me, is the heart and soul of the chemistry of this state.
The fundamental reason that we have the primary has always been that to give the little guy a chance. It was the little guy that put the legislation in because he wanted to be able to have a say in the process. So, and the reason that we kept it, whereas most states by the 1920s, 30s, were getting rid of it, because we kept it because the people here wanted it and were willing to pay for it, and it was their opportunity to be a part of the process. It continues today, and if you look at, you have the chart, you take the 4 states now that in the last few cycles, with 50%, there's not another place in the country that does that has turnouts like we have. We have, in the last 50 years, we have typically been the highest turnout, but not just the highest turnout, but the highest turnout by double digit. Next state after us is way below it. And that, you know, the argument is that if a state had the first primary, well, we'll see, we'll do like you, but this year there'll be able to be a comparison before 2028 in South Carolina. South Carolina says that they have the first primary this year, and we'll see what the turnout there is. The other factor is the candidates. We make it very easy for people to run. We don't screen candidates, we don't require you to be an elected official. Anyone who wants to be on the ballot can get on the ballot. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the country. And if you look at the filings this year, for instance, North Carolina in the Democratic primary, even though they have the president, they have 2 people running, that's all. And the filing fee in South Carolina on the Republican side was $50,000. Some years it's $40,000, some years it's more than 50, because the party gets a chunk of the filing fee and then the state gets some of it. But for us it's $1,000, and if you're indigent, you only have to get 10 signatures in each of the 10 counties and you can get on the ballot without paying. So it's a process about for the little guy and about the little guy, and then the participation, there's no question about it. And states say, well, if you give us the chance to be first, we'll match it. It's easier said than done, but we'll have the closest opportunity to see that from this side. What Governor Sununu mentioned about everybody having a say in this, you know, it's always been a battle because the big shots have wanted to control this. It used to be the King Caucus until New Hampshire came up with the idea of there being a national convention to expand the opportunity for more people to be part of the process. It wasn't going to be just U.S. senators and cabinet members and House members. So New Hampshire in 1831 proposed to the other 29 states to get rid of the King Caucus. And all but one state agreed to that, and that's how the first national Democratic nominating convention took place a year later in 1832. And New Hampshire, the person that sponsored the bill simply said, well, why don't we all have a chance to be delegates? And so the first law was that anybody in New Hampshire who wanted to pay $10 could get on the ballot and run to be elected as a delegate. And as I said earlier, most states ended up getting rid of primaries because, like South Carolina in 2020, there was a Republican legislature and a Republican governor, and they said we don't need to pay to have a primary because we've got our person. And that happened all across the country in the 1920s and 30s, and that's why by 68 there were 13 states that had primaries. That's why ours was so significant, because of what happened. We had 5 weeks between the primary in March and the next primary was in Illinois in April. And all that happened in between, the incumbent president realizing, changing his mind, said he's not going to run. New Hampshire had that impact that made a lot of people in the country say, wow, the little guy can really make a difference here. The little guy can really mean something. And so the struggle this time, we have more candidates that have dropped out before the New Hampshire primary, and that's because on the Republican side, these debates, you had to prove that you had so much money to be able to get into the first one, then you needed more money to get into the second one, and you needed more money to get into the third one. And on the Democratic side, the incumbent president decided there shouldn't be a New Hampshire primary. So it's always sort of been, you know, the battle between just the voters. In New Hampshire, it's all about the voters. We don't have a major political figure like South Carolina has Representative Clyburn, who has a huge influence. We don't have a major corporation that employs a third of the people in the state. We don't have dominant labor unions that have a big say among a certain portion of the electorate. We don't have any of that. When people come to New Hampshire, the voters here individually have the say, and they always have had. And that's partly why we have had these upsets and these stories that New Hampshire turns things upside down, because it's such a different place to come in and file. And both of you have chaired for multiple campaigns, so you've had the contact after the years, and people have come back and talked to you. My experience, whenever I get to see a former candidate, I always ask them, you know, what do you remember? What do you think of it? What is a positive experience? And I've had, and most candidates lose, because like this time we've got 45 candidates on the ballot. They're going to be 2 winners. Sometimes a second place finisher like Bill Clinton was able to turn it into being, but usually most of the people lose. But they all have had a positive experience. They've all expressed that to me. Now, I haven't talked to 100% of them, but I've talked to a lot of them. And I remember Jimmy Carter being interviewed about 15 years ago, just before the primary cycle was beginning. And he was asked, what do you remember when you ran for president? We're starting the primaries. They're going to be coming along in a few weeks. What do you remember about it? And he said, the only one I remember is New Hampshire. The rest of it's kind of a fog, because I was traveling everywhere. But in New Hampshire, he said, I can remember the places I stayed, the people that welcomed me into their houses. And that's a typical, and he's the one president who never actually came back here after that. But when he was president, on the anniversary of the New Hampshire presidential primary, he invited to the White House all of the families, and there were 20-some of them, that let him stay overnight in their house when he was campaigning, because he was a classic. Came here, nobody knew who he was, spoke a different language somewhat, hadn't experienced snow, and he was just a former Southern governor, but he worked it, and he connected, and he went on to be president. No one ever thought that could be possible. But how about you? You've talked to people over the years. Because we do have more people that lose here, but what happens here stays with them for some reason.
I can tell you that, you know, I went down and served 3.5 years in the White House with George H.W. Bush, and multiple times, you know, during a month, over a year, something would come up that would remind him of something that happened in New Hampshire. And the guy he had a very, really surprisingly good memory for specific names of specific people that he had interacted with. So it was clear that wasn't just the 10 days or whatever it is, 8 days between Iowa and New Hampshire. He was talking about the whole year of campaigning that we dragged him up here to do, but he remembered, like Jimmy Carter, he remembered a lot of the people he was involved with.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so why don't we take some questions from the audience if there are any. David?
Well, I've been here for a bunch of primaries, although in this room I'm a newbie, but I'll be honest, this one has the least energy and excitement of anyone I've encountered by a long shot, for a variety of reasons. Do you think that's indicative that New Hampshire's primary is losing its special status?
I certainly don't think so. Every primary is different. As I mentioned earlier, the dynamics are different. So I don't think it's any less special than it has been, or any less special than it's going to be in the future. We're always going to have our primary, presidential primary, on the Republican side and the Democratic side. Turnout is high, as Bill Gardner showed. So I don't think we are losing our special nature of it.
I think the problem is an ignorant press that assumes that it's over. And you know, you cannot read any article on the 2024 presidential campaign without the story saying it's over. And I think that's what you are seeing reflected in the vibrations you are or are not feeling in the process. And I'm not talking about our local press, I'm talking about the national press. Our local press is much, much smarter than those guys.
With the rise of rallies, starting with President Obama and now President Trump, has that impacted the state of one-on-one reaction to voters in the past few cycles?
I think most of the candidates have moved towards the McCain model, if I can call it that, of lots and lots of town halls. And so, yeah, President Trump has his rallies, Obama had his rallies, but I think for the most part, all the candidates really have drifted to the town hall model. And I think at the end of it opens it up to questions. It doesn't mean that everyone gets a chance to ask a question, but they are interacting at least for a few questions, a number of questions, one-on-one with the voters. And because they're holding so many of those, I think probably the number of interactions is the same or better than it's been before.
I think describing it that way, like the McCain model, I think that's a good way to describe it. He struggled initially in New Hampshire. Coming out of Iowa, he did well in Iowa. But then he decided just to do what you said. He had many, many town hall meetings. And he would stay until the last person left and the last question was asked. And he really epitomized retail politics here in New Hampshire. So I don't think that model has been compromised at all in terms of what's needed to do well here in New Hampshire.
What's more questions? Well, it's probably a good time to wrap this up. You know, the governors might hang out here for a couple of minutes if you want to come up.
Can I ask a question?
Emma?
I'm just curious to the governors what your prediction is for Tuesday, if you have any. And do you think that Donald Trump, as we saw in the latest St. Anselm poll that just came out as you guys were speaking, he's at 52% and Haley's at 38%. Do you think she still has the ability over the next week to be able to get that momentum to come in first in the state, or what are you thinking?
The pollsters don't tell you, but they have no idea how to decide what to sample because of the independent undeclared voter contingency that's in there. So with all due respect to them pontificating a number, they haven't got the slightest idea.
I think the polling is inherently unreliable. As I mentioned, the story of Hillary Clinton coming here after Iowa. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen in New Hampshire. I have no idea in terms of people ask me all the time, what are your expectations? I don't know.
George Bush, when he came in '88, was behind in every poll between Iowa and the New Hampshire primary, and he won by 10.
And what about from the Democratic side?
I don't think Dean Phillips is going to get over 50%. I give him credit. He's worked hard. I mean, he seems to have been around a lot. I don't know how many events he's been. Have you run into him?
I have no idea. I haven't even met him, so I don't know.
Well, that's his first mistake. You should have called him. No, I'm serious. It is silly not to call a former governor in your party and introduce yourselves.
I have a question.
Yes.
How well do you think the Biden write-in effort is going to go, and are you a fan of it?
The what?
The Biden
write-in effort. The Biden write-in effort will go. Are you a fan of it?
I think they're working very, very hard. I think there are a lot of very active Democrats who are supporting that effort. I don't know what the expectation is because it's hard to know with a write-in, which is more complicated. Obviously, there are more barriers to voting than there ordinarily are. But I applaud their efforts. I mean, the Democrats really care about the outcome of the election. I have said, in spite of my opposition to the decision to dismiss New Hampshire, that I'm going to continue to support Joe Biden, and I'll do that on Election Day as well. So, again, I think he's going to do okay, but it's hard to set a percentage in terms of the threshold he has to meet.
Let me comment on that. It's a very important question. And you'd like to see it discussed before the result rather than rationalized after the result. Remember, Lyndon Johnson in '68 was a write-in candidate. He got 49.7% of the vote. Bill, does Manchester still vote machines?
They use optical scan ballot candidates.
Okay, so it's not the old... No, when Lyndon Johnson got his 49.7% write-in, Manchester and I think Nashua were voting with the levered machines. The reason that's important, it's almost impossible to cast a write-in ballot on a levered machine. There's a way of doing it, but you end up having to write almost sideways in a little window. You can't get write-in ballots. And Manchester and Nashua were a huge percentage of the Democratic primary in 1968. So for Lyndon Johnson to get 49.7% of the vote on a write-in, in my opinion, was astoundingly good. But the press deemed that it wasn't good enough, scared the hell out of Johnson, and he got out of the race. So the point I'm making is, I think it will be compared to what Johnson got in '68. If he gets dramatically over 49.7, it will be deemed a huge success. I'm afraid that if he gets less than 49.7, it'll be compared to Lyndon Johnson and deemed a failure, or whatever they want to call it. But I just urge people to analyze it in the context of the fact that it's really not that easy across the board to get a write-in ballot.
So I'd like to, was there a question?
Yeah.
It's about the mechanics of tallying the election with all these write-ins. What is that impact, and is it going to delay results?
Well, you'd have to ask David or Billy that.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to delay the results that much. If you remember, it's one ballot, it's one race on a ballot, and it's vote for one. And to the extent that there are write-in votes on those ballots, it will simply be a sort and stack. The write-in votes will be separated out of the bigger ballots, and then they'll be put in piles according to the candidate, and then they'll be counted up. And I know that most of the polling places have ramped up with additional help, and so I don't think it's going to take that long.
It's another reality of New Hampshire that with all the elections we have a great cadre of volunteers who really make the counting process work. They're the unsung heroes, but they maintain the quality and the integrity and the quick response of our system. It's really
what people don't think about is that we used to have vice president on the ballot until about 10 years ago. So there were a lot of write-ins for vice president, and Agnew had to write in. Nixon, Eisenhower had thoughts of removing Nixon for his second term, and there was a big write-in for Nixon in New Hampshire, and that had a big impact in Washington, and Nixon stayed. But there have been multiple write-ins over the years, but we don't have the machines that Governor Sununu is talking about anymore. They were actually banned in '86 while you were governor. The Ballot Law Commission banned the lever machines, and they banned punch cards. We had punch cards that were banned 14 years before what happened in Florida in 2000. So, and we actually were the first state to have a law that requires every voter in this state to vote on a paper ballot. And that goes back to the early 90s. We were the first in the country and that came because of these machines, that it was so difficult. I remember doing recounts, looking at the backs of those machines, and there was no paper at all, and sometimes it has these rolls with the numbers, and sometimes the metal was halfway between the 6 and the 7, and you didn't know whether it was 650 or 600 or 700. It was a nightmare, but the legislature dealt with that.
So I'd like to just add quickly that as governor, it's a real honor to be in that position during these presidential primaries. Because what happens is candidates file in the Secretary of State's office, and then invariably they come to the governor's office. And you spend an hour with them and get to know them as people. And I always found that to be very special. You can be ambassadors for New Hampshire. I developed a great relationship with John McCain, Mike Huckabee, who I knew from the National Governors Association, as well as Hillary. So it's such, as I said, an honor to be governor during that time. I also want to thank Bill for all he's done, and Dave for all you will be doing with regard to New Hampshire primary.
Governor, you of all the governors, you were actually introducing Republican candidates at their own events. Mm-hmm. That's pretty rare.
It wasn't at their own event. Well, I did that with John McCain. What happened, just very quickly, is John McCain was having an event in my hometown, in the Hopkinton Town Hall. And unbeknownst to me, Peter Spaulding had called and invited me to the event. I never got that message. My daughter wanted to go see John McCain. So I said, okay, so we drove to the town hall, and I was planning just to stand in the back, and John McCain asked me to come up on stage. So I came up on stage and said nice things about me. He said, you're a great governor, you're my favorite governor in the country, and he went on and on about how much he appreciated my governing in a bipartisan way. And I said to John McCain, you know, we welcome you to Hopkinton. You're a real American hero, which he was, and he's done so much for our country and for the world. Well, right after that, there were some Republicans who blasted McCain for saying nice things about me. There's some Democrats who blasted me about saying nice things about McCain. But people really appreciate that, because most people are bipartisan, and I developed a lifelong friendship with John McCain. And with Mike Huckabee, I remember Mike Huckabee was speaking before the Concord Chamber of Commerce. And I got to know Mike, as I said, through the NGA, and so I called Mike and I said, would you like me to introduce you? Mike said, you can't do that. I said, sure I can. He said, I don't know who'll get in trouble more, me or you. But I introduced him. And some people didn't like that, but then there's certainly letters of the editor applauding the fact that Mike Huckabee and I were together. So I think, again, that the governor has an opportunity to be bipartisan during these presidential primaries.
In '92, the election cycle for '92, I was in the White House until spring of '92. Sometime in '91, the spring of '91, I got a call from Bill Clinton. I was in the White House as chief of staff, and we had gotten to know each other very well. He was chairman of the NGA. When I was vice chairman, I took over as chairman from him, and he chaired some committees for me. So we were very close in terms of a working relationship. And he asked me for some recommendations on who ought to be his chairman for the New Hampshire primary. I gave him a list of 3 Democratic activists. He picked Broderick out of that pile. But that's, you know, you get that kind of a relationship with governors, and it really is part of the fun, I think, of being governor.
Yeah.
Let me add one thing before we close. I often get asked the question, how has New Hampshire been able to keep the first in the nation primary for the last 40 some odd years when it's difficult? And it's a very easy answer, Bill Gardner.
Oh, that's a good way to close.
Bill, do you have any closing remarks? Bill, do you have any closing remarks? Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. This has been another great event, and hopefully it won't be 24 years before the next one.
Good job. They all nice to see you again.
Really right. Much better.